So I want to begin where Haley left off in terms of the publishing of the Vision for Black Lives, which happened last Monday. And this is, I think, a really enormous development in the history of the Black Lives Matter movement for a number of reasons. First of all, it of course articulates a set of problems facing Black America. The document rightly calls what's happening a war on Black America, and it also articulates a set of demands that can be raised by activists, put forward by the platform. It also expresses the sentiments of a group of people who have gone through the past few years in the Black Lives Matter movement and have drawn a set of conclusions about the nature of racism in this country, connections with other forms of oppression, and so on. And so while the bulk of it is about this war on Black America, its contours, some solutions to it, things like ending mass incarceration, things like reparations for slavery, and subsequent examples of institutional racism, and so on. It also talks about the oppression of LGBTQ people. It also takes a stand of solidarity with Palestine. It also talks about the various militaristic adventures that the United States conducts around the world, which are not only examples of violence abroad exported by the United States, but also violence domestically, because the money that funds that is stolen from the working class in the United States, particularly Black communities, and so on. It is also significant that this document was published in an election year in a country that describes itself as the world's greatest democracy, at a time when basically every other social movement in the United States has basically been demobilized. The immigrant rights movement, the movement for environmental justice, the women's rights movement, and so on, have largely been demobilized because the idea is that if you're serious about affecting change, then you have to get involved with the elections. So, which of course is a lie. It has been really disastrous for our side. And so the fact that despite that pressure, that tremendous pressure, this statement was put forward does, I think, represent some of the independence, or an effort at independence from the political system that Haley was talking about. So I want to wrap up and get into the discussion by talking a bit about where things are at the moment. If the vision is for let me say what I think the vision should be for revolution. Right? That's where we have to go. We have to talk about a complete social transformation of U.S. society, because the United States was founded on slavery, and what that means is that every single facet of American life is shaped by anti-Black racism. For example, it is not possible to have a criminal justice system or a prison system in the United States that is not racist. You cannot have a prison system and take the racism out of it. It must be destroyed. It's impossible to have an education system, that is not racist as the United States is currently constituted. It must be completely socially transformed, right? So we're talking about a broad social transformation and a revolution that involves the entire U.S. working class, and I think centrally involves the question of Black liberation. Where are we? I'm sorry to say that's not happening tomorrow. Right? But I do think that in terms of more people drawing conclusions that the question of Black freedom is bound up with the freedom of others, things are kind of pointed in that direction for a number of reasons. And one is that, as I said before, it's not the case that there's this nightmarish reality for Black people in the United States, but everybody else is doing great. Like it's actually the entire society is in a state of utter crisis. And one sort of manifestation of that crisis is this tremendous social polarization in terms of how people make sense of things in the United States, which is the only way that one can explain the rise of both Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump.
So let's see. It's such a good discussion. So I'm definitely not going to get to everything, but I want to talk to I forget your name. Yeah. Ray? Yeah. You mentioned, I think, an important point, which actually you did as well, that not everybody's starting out from the point of we need to abolish the police. Obviously that's not true. We have a society where radicals don't have as big a voice. The left is extremely small. We actually need to be in the project of rebuilding that and being part of rebuilding that, and movements are the way we're going to be able to begin that process. But I think that, it really is worth arguing with people, because think about, okay, I think one of the best examples I gave is actually an example from one of the mothers of the movement, whose son was killed by police. She mentions how during 9/11 in the US, there, prior to 9/11 was a movement against police brutality. You know what I mean? Dating all the way back to the Rodney King riots. There was an awareness that there was racial disparity within the criminal justice system. There were the beginnings of similar work by people like Angela Davis and other people prior to Michelle Alexander, pointing out, just how egregious this system was. And that was shut down by 9/11 and this drive towards security and this, assumption of terrorism, that this is like a regular feature, that it has nothing to do with our foreign policy. It's just they hate us. We don't know why.
Our freedoms.
Our freedoms. Oh, that's right. Most incarcerated country in the world. So, I think that that's a really important point, because the point is, if you're saying that we need security, it's like, well, what does that actually mean? Are we secure now? Police kill more people than any of the terror attacks, in the last year, any given year. So that's not a force for actually making people more secure. And actually, the apparatuses that are built up either through the war on terror come home. I mean, there's a really crazy thing that happened with one of the people who was involved in the killing of police officers, incidentally, who was a veteran, by the way, where the police sent this robot and literally just executed him summarily on the spot. The fact that that exists in, multiple police departments around the country, I mean, that's absolutely horrifying. And I think it should, the way that people get scapegoated, security, I think we have to understand that actually, we have something we have a stake in being in solidarity, not with the police force or the military. We actually have a stake in being in solidarity with the refugees who are also fleeing a form of terror that is actually instigated by our own government. We're in the same boat, and that's a point I think that needs to be made, that if we actually end those wars, that's how we'll win security, not by beefing up our security apparatus that actually gets used against our populations, right? I think I just wanted to talk a little bit about, if people haven't read Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow, I think that it's absolutely essential reading, just to really understand how racism operates today and why we need an anti-racist movement that's explicit in its aims. It's that's at the center of our project. If we want to win revolutionary change, because she goes through, what it means to live in a so-called colorblind society. That is a system where the laws on the books do not explicitly target any particular group of people, but in practice are a system of racialized social control. And she talks about how the system immunizes itself. So there's a case called Tennessee versus Garner, which I think is what you're referring to, which is basically this, it sets the standard for police officers to use excessive force as objectively reasonable. I feared for my life. How many times have we heard every single officer, no matter what, the black person is on the ground with his hands in the air, somehow I feared for my life, is this standard that's set. There's also McCluskey versus Kemp, which basically says that you need to actually hear someone use the N-word, or you need to understand that the intent of that person was to be racist, rather than understanding that the system, the actual outcome of racist policy is what constitutes racism. It's not the ideas in people's heads, but that system. And I think it's worth noting when we have this question of, is it all police? I mean, black police officers, account for, I think 10% of all police killings, but 78% of the people they kill are black. So, that clearly is not a solution, to that issue. You actually need to take on the police force itself. The last thing I was gonna say, I wanted to say a word about victories, because I feel like there are so few that we can point to, and there are a few that actually this movement has won, and as small as they are, I think they really do point the way forward, and I think they get at a lot of what's been asked in this conversation about, what is the role of allies? Like, do we have a stake in this movement if we're not actually Black people? Like, what exactly does that look like? And I think that if you look at what happened, do people know about Mizzou, the University of Missouri? Well, if you don't, basically there was a movement that actually successfully ousted the president of the college because of the enormous number of racist incidents happening on campus. There was actually a person who was at one point going on hunger strike in protest, and he was joined by the football team. Now, the football team on this campus was 8% of, the population of Mizzou is 8% Black, but the football team, they bring in tons of money for the school. They actually went on strike and refused to play. The entire faculty, went on strike in solidarity on a one-day walkout. The student population, you know what, you couldn't have done that if it wasn't everybody at that school seeing that fight as something they had a stake in, and they actually won. So it wouldn't have been a fight that could have been won if it had only been that 8% of the population, but both their strategic position within that school and the fact that they actually built, a mass movement basically on their campus, I think is a microcosm of what we actually have to build on a broader scale. And in terms of the question of, where does our economic power lie to do that? I mean, I actually think that, we have a multiracial working class. There's a tendency, especially in the US, to see the working class as like white and not having an interest in these things. But if we're going to actually combat the enormous inequality we actually need a working class that sees the fight against racism as central to its own fight for liberation. So I'll end with that.
Okay. First, a quick point. Folks have spoken. It's been great to hear about, folks talk about the question of Black Lives Matter and the impact that it's had ideologically where folks live outside of the United States in places like Canada and elsewhere, and how people are like, oh, that's a problem in the US, but we don't have that problem here. Okay, so, Black Lives Matter, the phrase, should be very uncontroversial, right? Black Lives Matter is a pretty basic concept. If people disagree with that, there's racism in your society. So it's like, here's a test, you can do it at home. Say Black Lives Matter. And people are like, I don't know about that. Then you have a fucking problem with racism. All right, I want to talk about. I think maybe next time, since we feel so. We have this wealth of time that I'm not used to. It's really exciting. So I want to, maybe I'll talk when we come back later about questions of revolution.
There are 10 minutes left now.
Oh. See, under capitalism, everything's a scarce. All right. Well, so let me just say a word then. I want to get to the question of revolution, but I want to say something about the question of privilege and allyship. Which I think is kind of there's a lot of conversations in the Black Lives Matter movement about those questions, and it's complicated by the fact that when people talk about privilege, when people talk about allyship, people often mean different things. And so I want to talk about what I think is some kind of dominant conceptions of privilege and allyship, and relate them to the question of Black liberation, and argue that I think that there's something limited about that framework. And I want to offer a different approach, because I think that fundamentally the question of when we look at society through the lens of relative social privileges, we see fundamentally society is composed of individuals, some of whom on a gradation are doing better off than others. And I think instead it's useful to look at two things. One is social structures, and then the question of consciousness, which I think that the question of privilege tends to conflate. That is, white people, by virtue of being white, are also racist. That is, the consciousness of white people is fused with the question of their white identity, which I actually don't think is necessarily true. People can, there are white people who can come to anti-racist conclusions. There are plenty of Black people who hold racist ideas as well. We're not somehow immune from the racist kind of just avalanche that we encounter daily. So instead, I want to divide those two things out: social structures and consciousness. So I was at a meeting recently in Boston where somebody was talking about the question of whether or not we can convince police to be anti-racist, and he says, I think we can convince white people to be anti-racist, so why not convince police to be anti-racist? Well, I think that the police and then working class white folks are actually two different social groups in society. Somebody made a point about the question of good cops and bad cops. And we have to look at, when the police murder black folks in the US, we can't see as like an individual cop who murders them. Darren Wilson is the cop who pulled the trigger that killed Michael Brown. But it wasn't Darren Wilson alone who let Michael Brown's body sit in the sun for 4.5 hours. That was a decision of the Ferguson Police Department. Okay? It wasn't Darren Wilson who then mobilized various police departments to repress black people in the National Guard. We're talking about a whole social structure where the police are necessarily racist. Regardless of what is on their minds at a given moment, they're enforcing laws that are racist, that necessarily, affect black people in particular ways. The way that they enforce it is racist. I live in Boston is known in the United States as this big college town. There's over 100,000 students in Boston. There's many different campuses. If the police were serious about stopping drug use, they could raid any campus in Boston and round up thousands of people, right? That's not where they patrol. They patrol in the black neighborhoods, right? So the laws are racist. The means of enforcement are racist to play a racist social role. Working class white folks, I think, are in a very different category. It is just objectively true that working class white folks' fate is bound with the question of black freedom. I gave some examples from the 1960s before, but I also think about when we talk about what it would take to improve the lives of just working class people in general in the United States today, you can't seriously win those things without talking about racism against black people. That is, the city of Chicago spends, I think, tens of millions of dollars a year, not for the police department budget, that's hundreds of millions of dollars. Tens of millions of dollars is just spent on dealing with the lawsuits from all of the people who sue the Chicago Police Department. Okay?
And $500 million over the last decade.
$500 million over a decade. Not for the police department, these are for the lawsuits the city of Chicago has to pay out because they're sued so regularly. The city of Chicago is also closing many dozens of schools. I don't even know how many, every half year or so they announce a new round of closures, right? Education is unaffordable, even public education in cities like Chicago. So you're not going to, if people without an anti-racist analysis are demanding money for schools or make public education free, you cannot have a serious conversation about that without talking about what the city has decided to invest in, which is the police. And you can't have a serious conversation about the Chicago Police Department without talking about racism. Mm-hmm. That's just a fact, right? And it's also the case, as Eric said, that the absolute, brutal dehumanization of black life makes it such that life in general for ordinary people in the United States is devalued. So it's the case, I don't have to convince anybody here, I think everybody's convinced that the criminal justice system targets black people in an incredible way in the US. 1 in 3 black males in our lifetimes will be incarcerated in the US at some point in our lifetimes, right? So there's an enormous number of black folks incarcerated. It is also the case that at this moment, there are more white people incarcerated in the US than any other country in the world. Both of those things are true, and they're related. So no, we cannot talk about the advancement of lives for working class people and white folks, working class white folks in particular, without talking about the question of anti-black racism. Now that objective reality doesn't mean that white people are all anti-racist. That's a question of consciousness, which requires activism for us to intervene in. And it's going to be a messy process, because we have a fucked up society, right? So the city of Boston is this profoundly segregated place where there's white folks who've never set foot in a black neighborhood. We're not going to go from that seamlessly to a multiracial, unified mass movement overnight. That's going to be a process. It's going to be a difficult process at times. Not every single meeting will go perfectly. Not every single rally will go perfectly. But we've got to do it, and we can do it, and I think that it's possible.
I think since the movement started, there's been so much more of there's no choice. The movement keeps getting compared to the civil rights era, but I think that really it's a lot more similar to the Black Power era in terms of the challenges of the questions that it faced. If you think about, like, why do we keep coming back to the question of inequality, or why do we keep coming back to the question, like, why does it have to be, you know, why is it going to take a much more deep transformation? People have spoken well to that throughout this session, but I think that, you know, people in this, you know, late 60s and early 70s were coming to very revolutionary conclusions, and there were organizations that basically concluded that we would not have Black liberation if we didn't have solidarity. We would not have Black liberation if we did not have a confrontation with capitalism. And I think that that's extremely relevant today for many of the same reasons. We haven't quite solved those questions because those movements were beaten back. But one thing that I think is unfortunate as well is we don't really learn the history of those movements. So while people lift up the kind of the icons of the 1960s and 70s, sometimes, it's, especially, you know, in the States, we're not learning about the Panthers in most history classes in, you know, high school. But very often it's divorced from their actual politics, and there are debates within the movement about this question of solidarity, allyship, many different things. But I think it's especially telling, you know, there's one former Panther, Eddie Conway, who did an interview with the Real News Network, and basically they're asking him, you know, why were people afraid of you? People assume that it's because of the guns, and he says, no, it's because we were socialists. It's because we understood that we needed to organize not just Black people, but we needed to organize Puerto Rican people who were fighting for independence. We needed to organize with indigenous people. We needed to organize with Mexican people. We needed to organize with poor white people. And they saw themselves as being at the vanguard of that struggle. I think we need to create organizations now, while learning from some of the mistakes of that era, that actually have that vision in mind, that that is actually our job as people who are coming to radical conclusions and finding ways to bring more people on board with us as our movements grow. So I only wanted to say it because I just thought that was important, and I'm glad you brought it up, so thanks.
Let me say a few quick things about revolution. You know, and when folks are like, you know, how do we actually envision it? What does it look like? What's the plan? It's a difficult question to answer because the kind of revolution that we're talking about is this profoundly democratic thing, right? Like there isn't, I mean, I think about it every day, but the idea, it isn't like I've come up with something great, here it is. It's actually what we're talking about is masses of people getting together in our own self-activity and collectively actually creating something that none of us can really envision now, because what will be possible when that kind of power is mobilized is something of a difference that we can't, it's not yet even really conceivable. But when we have mass struggles and, you know, mass protests, we see, I think, in tiny embryonic form, what that kind of self-activity and empowerment could look like. I just want to share a couple of examples from the Black Lives Matter movement, which I think has given us many examples. In Boston, one of the first marches that we had, it was when the first non-indictment came down. I can't remember if it was Eric Garner's killers or Michael Brown's killers. But we had this huge demonstration in the center of the historic heart of Black Boston, and we marched. We marched chanting Black Lives Matter, and we ended up getting to a jail that was in another Black neighborhood. And as we rallied outside of the jail, we raised our fists and chanted, Black Lives Matter, Black Lives Matter. And inside, the inmates came to the windows, and they made signs. You know, some of them, I remember they took paper and made them into letters, and they spelled out the name Mike Brown in the windows. And they could, some of them could somehow control the light switch in their cells. And they made the lights flash on and off in a rhythm to our chants, Black Lives Matter, Black Lives Matter. So when we're talking about a struggle, when we're talking about ending mass incarceration, that isn't just, I mean, we should be thinking, Cole's right, we should be thinking about some reforms that we can put forward, but it's also, we're talking about something that goes beyond a bunch of clever people in a room coming up with a great proposal for the state. We're talking about a struggle, which you know, clever people should get in rooms and, you know, whatever. But we're talking about a struggle in the streets that involves a struggle of inmates themselves, it involves their families, and so on, to create something new. That's one example. Another example is comes from Baltimore, the Baltimore Uprising. This got not nearly the amount of attention that it deserved, But one of the big justifications, the main justification, of course, for police occupation of black communities in the United States is that there's this massive crime problem in the U.S., in black neighborhoods and so on, and gang violence in particular. Well, in Baltimore, during the Baltimore uprising, the Crips and the Bloods, which are the two kind of most notorious gangs in the United States, the Baltimore Crips and Bloods declared a truce. They said, we're no longer going to fight each other. We're going to join the rebellion. Okay? Now, so there's a lot to draw out of this example. First of all, how did the state respond? The police, whose supposed job is to keep us safe, who are so concerned with gang violence, how do they respond? Did they say, oh great, fantastic, our work here is done? No. Instead, they said, we have a credible threat to law enforcement, and they used that as a justification to come down harder that the gangs had united. So that's one lesson about where they stand. But what does it say about us? It says, there's so much, inevitably, at rallies for Black Lives Matter and in meetings for Black Lives Matter, when we talk about confronting the police, inevitably somebody says, yes, but we have to fix what's going on in our own communities. Well, of course, there's truth in that. But what we saw in Baltimore is that when people mobilized to confront the racist police, it created a unity in the black neighborhood that people hadn't foreseen, that wasn't the initial objective, but that came nonetheless. And so it ended up stopping violence within the community for a few days. And I think that shows some of the potential that can be fully unleashed in a revolution. So will a revolution happen in our lifetime, or will it be something after us? It'll happen in our lifetimes, I believe. I believe that we are in an extraordinary moment, not only in US history, but in world history. This isn't just something happening in the United States. This is not unconnected from the Maple Spring in Quebec, or from the 2011 uprisings across the Arab world, or the protests of the squares in Spain and Greece and so on. There's a global reality that austerity has forced this nightmare on the majority of people, and in particular places, it involves particular forms of oppression. And anti-black racism is, frankly, it's not restricted to the United States, as we know, but in the US, it is central. And therefore, this new generation and these new struggles that are emerging, that I think have the potential to fight for a different world, and if those of us who are revolutionaries get together and do what we can to learn the lessons of the past and lead these struggles forward, I think that we can win, and black liberation will be a central feature of it.